It all started falling apart when I was 21. My name's Ethan, and back then, I was just another college student, grinding my way through a business degree I wasn't passionate about, working part-time at a convenience store that barely covered my expenses. My parents, Mark and Susan, had always been overbearing, insisting they knew best about what my life should look like. For years, I let them mold my choices, but it was suffocating. One Thursday evening, we were having dinner at the table. Susan had made meatloaf, her favorite dish to cook, but one I could never stomach. I was doing my best to force it down when Mark, with his usual faux concerned tone, asked, "How's the business program going?" I knew this conversation would happen eventually, but my heart still sank when it did. I took a deep breath and put my fork down. Staring at the table, I muttered, "Actually, I've been thinking of switching my major." The air grew still. You could hear the faint hum of the fridge from the kitchen. Mark's face twisted in confusion and annoyance. "Switching majors? To what?" "Computer science," I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady. I wanted to sound confident, but inside I was bracing for impact. "Are you serious?" Susan interjected, her voice sharp. She always had this way of wrapping criticism in a patronizing tone. "Ethan, thinking isn't exactly your strong suit." My dad wasn't any more supportive. He slapped his fork onto the table. "Computer science? Are you out of your damn mind? You're throwing away your future for some hobby." "It's not a hobby," I said, my voice firmer now. "I'm good at this. I know I can make a career out of it." Mark scoffed, shaking his head. "Passion doesn't pay the bills, Ethan. You need to think about your future, not chase after whatever fad you think will make you happy." Susan nodded in agreement, chiming in, "You're not a child anymore. This is your future we're talking about." The conversation ended with me retreating to my room, their voices echoing in my head. That night I called Haley, my best friend and the only person who really understood me. "How'd it go?" she asked, even though we both knew the answer. "A disaster," I muttered. "They acted like I told them I was joining the circus." She sighed, her voice soft yet firm. "Ethan, you've got to stand up for yourself. It's your life, not theirs." I wanted to argue, to say it wasn't that simple, but deep down I knew she was right. I couldn't keep living under their thumb. The next morning I told them my decision. I wasn't prepared for their response. Mark crossed his arms and delivered his verdict coldly. "If you think you're such an adult, you can pack your things and leave." For a moment I thought he was bluffing. I stared at them, stunned. "You can't be serious." "Oh, we're serious," Susan said. "You have 24 hours. I was numb as I packed my things that night. By morning, I was walking out the door of the house I'd lived in my whole life, unsure where I was heading. Haley picked me up and drove me to her tiny apartment, where she promised I could crash on her couch. As she handed me a pillow, she said, "You'll figure this out. I know you will." I wasn't so sure. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just lost. I was homeless. The first few weeks after leaving my parents' house felt like a fever dream. Haley's apartment was barely big enough for one person, let alone two. She lived in a studio that smelled faintly of coffee and vanilla candles, with a tiny couch that became my bed. The cushions were lumpy, and I barely slept, but it was a roof over my head. I wasn't about to complain. At first, I thought I'd figure things out quickly, find a better job, settle into a routine. But reality didn't care about my plans. My savings dwindled faster than I'd expected, and every rejection email for jobs I applied to felt like another slap in the face. Haley kept encouraging me, telling me I just needed to keep pushing, but it wasn't that simple. My life had been flipped upside down in a single moment, and I didn't know how to rebuild. Days turned into weeks. I juggled my part-time job at the convenience store while trying to focus on my classes. My professors noticed I wasn't myself, and one even pulled me aside after class to ask if I was okay. "You've been falling behind, Ethan. Is everything all right?" "Yeah," I lied. "Just a lot going on." But the truth was, I wasn't all right. I was barely holding on. My grades slipped further as the weight of my situation bore down on me. Every time I sat down to study, my mind would wander to the fact that I was living out of a duffel bag and sleeping on someone else's couch. It was suffocating. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling shift at work, I came back to Haley's apartment and collapsed onto the couch. She walked in with takeout and set the bags on the counter. "You've got to eat," she said, pulling out a container of fries and a burger. "I'm not hungry," I muttered, burying my face in the cushion. Ethan, come on, you've got to keep your strength up. She sat down next to me and handed me the food. Reluctantly, I took it and started eating, even though I didn't have much of an appetite. Thanks, I mumbled. You're going to get through this, she said, her voice firm. It sucks right now, but it won't always be like this. I don't know, I said, staring at the floor. I feel like I'm stuck. I can't focus on school, I don't have money, and I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. She leaned over and put a hand on my shoulder. You're doing the best you can, Ethan, and that's enough for now. I nodded, but deep down, I wasn't sure if I believed her. A few more weeks passed, and my savings hit rock bottom. Haley tried to help where she could, but I couldn't keep leaning on her forever. I knew I had to make a decision, and it wasn't one I wanted to make. The day I dropped out of college felt like admitting defeat. I sat in the dean's office, filling out the paperwork with shaking hands. The dean gave me a sympathetic look, but I barely heard her as she explained the process. All I could think about was how I'd failed, not just myself, but everyone who'd ever believed in me. That night, I told Haley. She didn't judge me, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. You did what you had to do, she said softly. But this isn't the end, okay? It's just a new chapter. I wanted to believe her, but it felt like I was at the end of the road. Without school to focus on. I threw myself into finding more work. After dozens of applications and even more rejections, the only place that hired me was a rundown diner called Joe's Grill. It was a greasy, chaotic mess of a place, and my job consisted of flipping burgers, mopping floors, and trying not to lose my mind under the constant yelling of Earl, the manager. Earl was a no-nonsense type with a gravelly voice and a permanent scowl. If you're on my clock, you're working. Got it? He barked on my first day. Yes, sir, I replied, pulling on a grease-stained apron. The pay was barely enough to scrape by, but it was something. I worked long hours, coming home every night smelling like burnt meat and fryer oil. Haley tried to cheer me up, but I could tell she was worried about me. I wasn't the same person I'd been before all this. One day, Earl pulled me aside during a slow shift. Kid, you've got a decent work ethic, he said, scratching his chin. You interested in picking up extra hours? I nodded without hesitation. Yeah, what do you need? My buddy downtown needs a night guard for his office building. Pays better than here. You in? I'm in. And just like that, I was working 2 jobs, flipping burgers by day and guarding an empty office building by night. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Most nights, I'd collapse onto Haley's couch for a couple of hours before dragging myself to the next shift. I was running on fumes, but I didn't have a choice. I had to survive. As the weeks turned into months, the grind started to take its toll. I was exhausted, burnt out, and still barely scraping by. One night, while sitting in the empty office building, I stared out at the city lights and wondered how my life had turned out like this. Just a few months ago, I'd had dreams, plans, a future. Now, I was just trying to make it through another day. But despite everything, there was a tiny spark of hope inside me. I still had my passion for coding, even if I didn't have the time or energy to pursue it, and I knew deep down that I couldn't give up on it, not yet. The double shifts were wearing me down, but I kept at it because I didn't see another way. I didn't have the luxury of taking a break or figuring things out. Every day felt like a cycle I couldn't escape. Wake up exhausted, flip burgers, nap for an hour, guard an empty building, repeat. Haley did her best to keep me grounded, dropping off snacks or just hanging out with me when I wasn't too drained to hold a conversation. But no matter how supportive she was, I still felt like I was stuck in quicksand. One day, I was at the diner during a slow afternoon shift. Earl had stepped out, and I was behind the counter, trying to make sense of some coding exercises on my laptop during my break. It was one of the only things that made me feel like myself again, those moments when I could immerse myself in lines of code and forget about the mess my life had become. That's when he walked in. He looked like any other diner customer. Tie loosened, dark circles under his eyes. The kind of guy who'd probably been at the office way too late the night before. He ordered a cheeseburger, fries, and a coffee, and I didn't think much of it. But when he came up to pay, he glanced at my laptop and raised an eyebrow. You into coding? He asked, his voice casual but curious. Yeah, I said, trying to sound normal and not like someone who was barely holding it together. I've been teaching myself. He nodded, his expression shifting from polite curiosity to genuine interest. I work for a startup downtown. We're looking for entry-level IT guys. Nothing fancy, but it's a foot in the door. You interested? My heart skipped a beat. Seriously? Seriously, he said, pulling out a business card and sliding it across the counter. Send me your resume. I stared at the card for a second, half expecting it to disappear like some kind of cruel mirage. But it was real, and so was the chance he was offering me. That night, I didn't care how tired I was. As soon as I got back to Haley's apartment, I fired up my laptop and worked on my resume. It wasn't much to look at. No degree, no fancy internships. But I highlighted every skill I'd taught myself and attached some of the small projects I'd worked on. Think they'll take me seriously? I asked Haley as I typed out the email. They'd be stupid not to, she said with a smile. You've got this. I sent the email before I could overthink it and tried not to get my hopes up. A few days passed and I didn't hear anything. Part of me figured the guy was just being nice, throwing out an offer he didn't expect me to follow up on. But then, late one night during my shift at the office building, my phone buzzed. It was an email from the company. I stared at the screen, too scared to open it. My hands shook as I finally tapped the notification. It wasn't a rejection. It was an invitation to interview. The interview was nothing like I'd imagined. The startup wasn't some shiny tech giant with glass walls and endless perks. It was a small office tucked away on the 5th floor of a plain building downtown. When I walked in, wearing a shirt I'd borrowed from Haley and shoes I'd scrubbed until they didn't look like they belonged to someone who worked in a diner, I felt out of place. Trevor, the guy from the diner, greeted me at the door. Glad you made it, he said, leading me inside. He introduced me to his boss, a no-nonsense woman named Mia, who looked like she didn't have time for small talk. The interview wasn't easy. Mia asked about my experience, and I had to admit that I didn't have a degree. But I showed her the projects I'd worked on, and when she handed me a coding challenge to solve on the spot, I took a deep breath and dove in. My mind raced as I worked through the problem, drawing on everything I'd taught myself during those sleepless nights. When I finished, Mia looked over my shoulder, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded and said, "You've got potential. Let's give you a shot." Starting at the company was surreal. It wasn't glamorous, but it was worlds away from the diner or the office building. For the first time in months, I felt like I was doing something that mattered. Trevor and Mia were patient with me, showing me the ropes without holding my hand. But they also made it clear that they expected me to keep up, to prove I belonged there. I still kept my other jobs for a while just in case. It wasn't sustainable, but I was too scared to let go of that safety net. Haley was the one who finally sat me down and said, "Ethan, you've got to let something go. You can't keep burning yourself out like this." She was right. A few weeks later, I quit the diner. Earl didn't say much, but as I handed him my apron, he muttered, "Good luck, kid. You're a hard worker. You'll be fine." Walking out of Joe's Grill for the last time felt like shedding a layer of my old life. It was terrifying, but it also felt right. At the startup, I threw myself into learning everything I could. The work wasn't easy, but every challenge reminded me why I'd fought so hard to get here. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving, I was building something. And that spark I thought I'd lost? It was as the months went on, I started to find my rhythm at the startup. The work wasn't easy, but it was exciting in a way nothing else had been. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was doing something I cared about. Every day was a new challenge, and with each task I completed, I felt a little more confident in my abilities. Mia didn't hand out compliments freely, but when she did, you knew you'd earned them. One afternoon, she stopped by my desk after I'd finished a particularly tricky project. "Nice work on that," she said, her tone as casual as if she were commenting on the weather. The client was impressed. Hearing that felt like winning the lottery. I tried to play it cool, nodding and muttering, "Thanks," but inside I was glowing. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving, and for the first time I could see a future that wasn't dictated by desperation. Of course, things weren't perfect. Money was still tight, and even though I'd quit the diner, I was still holding on to the night security job. Sleep was a luxury I rarely indulged in, and some mornings I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Haley would call me out on it, her concern showing every time she caught me yawning through a conversation. "You're going to burn out if you don't slow down," she said one evening, sitting cross-legged on the couch as we shared takeout. "You can't keep running on empty." "I'll be fine," I replied, brushing her off. "I just need to push through for a little while longer." She didn't argue, but the look in her eyes told me she wasn't convinced, and honestly, neither was I. Mia's encouragement to take risks stayed in my mind. One day, she handed me a file for a new client. "This is a big one," she said, her sharp eyes locking onto mine. "I want you to take point on this." I blinked, stunned. "Me? Are you sure?" "You've got the skills, Ethan," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "Don't let doubt hold you back." The project was daunting, a complete overhaul of the client's IT infrastructure. It was more responsibility than I'd ever had, and part of me was terrified I'd screw it up, but another part of me felt a spark of excitement. This was my chance to prove that I wasn't just coasting, that I deserved to be here. I threw myself into the work, spending late nights and weekends poring over every detail. My desk became a war zone of sticky notes and empty coffee cups, and my laptop barely left my side. Haley called it code mode, and she was right. I barely came up for air. The night before the final presentation, I sat in the office alone, double and triple checking every detail. My nerves were shot and my hands shook as I practiced my pitch for what felt like the 100th time. The pressure was immense, but I couldn't afford to fail. Not now. The next morning, I stood in the conference room in front of the client's team, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. I stumbled over a few words and fumbled a slide transition, but I kept going. I explained my plan, answered their questions, and did everything I could to convince them that I was the right person for the job. When I finished, the silence was deafening. The clients flipped through the documents, whispering to each other, and every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the head of their team looked up and said, "This looks solid, let's move forward." I barely managed to keep my composure as relief washed over me. Mia gave me a small nod from across the room, and I knew I'd done it. I'd faced my fears and come out on the other side. That night, I called Haley as I walked home. "They loved it," I said, my voice full of excitement. "We're moving forward with the plan." "I knew you'd crush it," she replied, and I could hear the pride in her voice. "You're killing it, Ethan." Hearing her say that made it all feel real. For so long, I'd been stuck in survival mode, but now I was starting to build something real, something mine. The success of that project marked a turning point for me. Mia began giving me more responsibility, and I started to feel like I wasn't just a cog in the machine. I was contributing, making a difference, and growing in ways I hadn't thought possible. One day, Mia called me into her office. "I want to talk about your future here," she said, her tone calm but serious. "You've been doing great work, and I think it's time we make it official. I want to offer you a full-time position." For a moment, I just stared at her, the words not quite registering. A full-time position meant stability. No more juggling jobs, no more wondering where my next paycheck would come from. It was everything I'd been working toward. "Yes," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions bubbling inside me. "Absolutely, yes." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Taking on a full-time role meant more work, more responsibility, and more challenges, but I welcomed it all. For the first time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground, like I had a future that wasn't just about getting by. At home, Haley and I started talking about what was next. "We should think about finding a place of our own," she said one evening, her voice filled with quiet excitement. "Something permanent." I nodded, a small smile creeping onto my face. "Yeah, I think it's time." Life was finally starting to feel like it was mine again, and I couldn't wait to see where it would take me next. Life had finally steadied. The full-time position gave me more than just a paycheck. It gave me confidence, a sense of purpose, and the ability to dream beyond mere survival. I started saving, building a foundation for the future I could finally picture. The days of juggling jobs and sleeping on couches felt like a distant memory. Haley and I dove into house hunting, spending weekends walking through open houses, imagining what life could look like in a home of our own. Every place we visited felt like a step closer to something permanent. It was an exciting time, full of possibilities, but nothing really clicked. And then, One night, I was scrolling through real estate listings when a familiar address stopped me cold. The house I grew up in was for sale. I stared at the screen, unsure how to feel. It had been years since I'd set foot in that house, years since my parents, Mark and Susan, had thrown me out. I hadn't spoken to them since, and I had no idea why the house was up for sale. The listing described it as a motivated sale, with a price that was well below market value. At first, I dismissed the idea. What kind of person buys their childhood home after being kicked out? It felt ridiculous, maybe even petty. But the longer I thought about it, the more the idea took root. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming something I'd lost. I had the means, and for once, I had the control. Within a few weeks, the deal was done. I didn't tell anyone but Haley, and even she looked at me like I was a little crazy when I told her what I was doing. "Are you sure about this?" she asked as I signed the final paperwork. "I am," I said firmly. "This feels right." After the purchase went through, the property manager reached out, saying the tenants wanted to meet the new landlord. I smiled to myself, knowing exactly who would be waiting for me. I asked him to set up the meeting. When the day arrived, I parked in front of the house and stared at it for a moment. It looked smaller than I remembered, a little more worn. The yard was overgrown and the paint was peeling in places, but it was still the house I'd grown up in. Taking a deep breath, I walked up to the door and knocked. Mark answered. His face was a mix of surprise and confusion when he saw me, and it took him a moment to recognize me. "Ethan?" he said, his voice thick with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to meet the tenants," I replied, stepping past him into the house. "You're looking at the new landlord." His jaw dropped, and for a moment he just stared at me, speechless. From the corner of my eye, I saw Susan walk in, her face going pale when she saw me. "You bought the house?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's right," I said, leaning casually against the wall, "and we need to talk about the rent." I kept my tone calm but firm as I explained the new terms. "The rent's going up, tripling actually. Property values in this area have skyrocketed, and I have to make sure I'm getting a fair return on my investment." They looked at me like I'd just grown a second head. Mark stammered, "You can't be serious, we can't afford that." "That's not my problem," I replied evenly. "You have two options, pay the new rent or find somewhere else to live." Susan tried to appeal to me, her voice trembling. "Ethan, please, we're your parents." I tilted my head, meeting her gaze. "And I was your son. That didn't stop you from throwing me out when I needed you the most." Their silence said everything. The power dynamic had shifted and they knew it. After a few moments, I added, "I'll give you some time to figure things out." Before turning and walking out the door, sitting in my car outside the house, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me was satisfied, maybe even a little vindicated. But another part of me felt hollow. Owning the house didn't erase the pain of what had happened. It didn't fix the years of distance or the damage to our relationship. For the first time in a long time, I realized this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about letting go. Life moved on. Haley and I eventually found a house of our own, a cozy place that felt like the fresh start we both needed. My career at the startup flourished, and I began dreaming bigger, envisioning a future that was entirely my own. A few years later, I took the leap and started my own company. It wasn't easy. There were long nights, tough decisions, and moments of doubt. But it was worth every bit of struggle. Watching my business grow felt like the culmination of everything I'd been through. Every obstacle I'd overcome. Looking back, I wouldn't change a thing. The pain, the struggle, the moments when I felt like giving up, they all led me here. I built a life on my terms, free from anyone else's expectations. And for the first time, I felt like I truly belonged in its story too. After 12 years of operating the family business, this story is titled, "My Parents Expelled Me and Appointed My Nephew, who is 22 years old, as CEO since he shares his mother's intelligence. They are now pleading for my assistance after he damaged the business." Hello, everyone. Finding these stories for you took a lot of time. Please click the subscribe button if you like the article. It keeps this adventure going strong and means the world. Together, let's develop. Let's begin the video now. OP says, "Hey Reddit," at the beginning. Although I've always considered myself to be a man with his act together, I've been beginning to doubt everything recently. I'll set the scene for everyone. All of this began at my dad's 62nd birthday celebration, and I can honestly say that it felt like my world suddenly turned upside down. For background, I have spent the last 12 years working for my dad's business. 12 years of hard work, perseverance, and business development. I believed I was set. I believed I would eventually inherit the business, as any devoted family member would anticipate after working hard. To be honest, it was quite a large party. We had family, friends, business partners, and more. This party was no exception to my parents' appreciation of a nice one. There were drinks available. The food was delicious. It seems that everyone was enjoying themselves. And then my father got up to raise a glass. I assumed it would be routine. A few jokes, sincere gratitude. Additionally, he might have mentioned how eager he was to retire. However, he surprised us by making that news. After considerable consideration and deliberation, I am pleased to announce that I am prepared to retire in a few months and have chosen to hand over the CEO role to a candidate who I believe can lead the organization to new heights. Mike, my grandchild. I went cold. Perhaps I had misheard him, I thought. Grandson, Mike. The 22-year-old is just out of business school. No actual experience. Nevertheless, he is the one taking over the business in some way. I have devoted more than 10 years of my life to. The compliments and acclaim that echoed through the room were like daggers. My stomach felt like it was about to burst from my body and my heart was racing. I was furious on the inside, but I tried to remain calm. I didn't detest Mike, don't get me wrong. When you're just talking to him at family gatherings, he's a fine enough kid. However, he lacks experience and is young. Since I have been running a business for years, I can declare with confidence that he has no idea what he is doing. Mike only possesses my parents' mistaken trust and a shiny degree. However, it seems that my years of labor, sweat, and tears invested in this firm were not worth anything. Everyone resumed mingling after the toast, but I was unable to comprehend what was going on. My wife must have thought I had seen a ghost since she asked me right away what was wrong when she came over to see how I was doing. I simply told her and shook my head. Later we discuss it. To figure out what the heck I was going to do, I needed time. I had a private conversation with my dad later that evening when everyone had left and the home was silent. I hoped he would clarify that it was really a formality or that I would still play a significant role. Something to support this crazy choice. However, no, he intensified. He informed me that he thought Mike was the best option because he was youthful, creative, and degree-holding. An absolute degree. In the meantime, I had spent more than 10 years managing the team, cultivating connections with clients, and running day-to-day operations. You may still work with him. He even dared to suggest mentor him, teach him the ropes. For me, that was it. I immediately informed him that I couldn't stay. After everything I had done for the company, I could never work under Mike again. At that moment, neither the money nor the title mattered. The principle was the one. I had merited that job. I was worthy. It seemed like a smack in the face to be told that I wasn't even taken into consideration. The days that followed were a haze. My parents tried to dissuade me from resigning by accusing me of being overly dramatic. I couldn't see it any other way, but I had to consider the family. I didn't see why I should stay if they didn't think highly enough of my work to offer me the position I had been vying for. I then packed up my office, submitted my resignation, and left. One of the most difficult things I've ever done was leave that office for the last time. I had been there for so long. I was familiar with the entire area, both the positive and negative aspects. For me, it was more than just a job. I have to deal with it. It was like chopping off a leg to leave, but I had to. I knew. It would have been worse to stay. All of this was made possible by my wife's tremendous support. She informed me that she was proud of me for advocating for myself and that she respected my choice. She was aware of how deeply this upset me, but she also understood that I couldn't continue to be treated disrespectfully. Since it seemed like the rest of my family was against me, their support meant the world to me. My mother continued calling to ask me to change my mind. One day, my dad even unexpectedly dropped by my residence to attempt to persuade me to return. However, I consistently said no when they asked. The sense of betrayal was the most difficult aspect of all of this. I had a tight relationship with my dad, particularly when we first started the business. It felt like he was discarding me after I sacrificed my own career to support him in realizing his ambition. For what purpose? Mike was seen by some as the future. It didn't make logical that he had a degree. Mike didn't get back to me after I left. My parents pushed on the job, so I'm not even sure if he wanted it or if he just accepted it. It didn't matter either way. The damage was already done. I had to make my own decision once my parents had made theirs. After quitting, the first few weeks were difficult. I couldn't stop reliving the exchange with my father in my mind, wondering whether there was anything I could have said or done. However, each time I reached the same conclusion. I made the correct decision. I couldn't have stayed and watched Mike struggle to manage the business while I stood on the sidelines, unable to speak. I was no longer the only one involved. It had to do with my dignity. Now, 6 months later, I'm still working on reassembling my life. In order to concentrate on determining my next course of action, I have been avoiding contact with my family. Even though it hurts to admit it, I believe that leaving was the wisest course of action. I had no incentive to remain if they were unable to recognize my value. I believed that I would permanently distance myself from the family business after I resigned. I didn't want to be reminded of it, hear about it, or even think about it. However, that is not how life operates, particularly if the item you're attempting to forget has a connection to your family. Even though I tried my hardest, I kept getting news about the business and Mike's terrible leadership. Little things were involved at first. Dude, Mike just fired 3 senior employees because they didn't vibe with his vision. A friend of mine who was still employed there texted me. The first thing that made me chuckle was how predictable it was. Not because it was hilarious. Mike was clueless about his actions. Those workers had been with us from the beginning and were well versed in the operations of the company. It was like chopping off an arm and expecting to run a marathon after losing them. I then learned that he was modifying our contracts in some daring ways. Although I support innovation, Mike was tampering with agreements that had been made over years. Clients that I had painstakingly cultivated began to drift away, bewildered and frustrated. My parents continued to support him. He is simply adapting. A common friend was informed by my mom. Everything is a part of the process. Yes, of course. The act of destroying a business. Then the most serious financial scam occurred. Since I'm not interested in getting into the specifics, I don't know all the details. However, based on my understanding, Mike attempted to exaggerate our figures in order to win over a significant client, a rookie error. The person merely waved a huge red flag that shouted, "Audit me," even though he probably thought he was being clever. The consequences were severe and swift. The company's image was destroyed. Lawsuits began to pile up as a large number of clients bailed. It was like watching a train crash in slow motion when I heard about all of this. I felt vindicated on the one hand. My parents ignored my warnings that Mike wasn't prepared for the position. However, it hurt to watch something I'd put so much effort into creating fall apart so quickly. I couldn't help but care, even if I didn't want to. For 12 years, that corporation had been my life. Seeing someone apply a sledgehammer to a house you constructed yourself was like that. Here's the problem, though. I wasn't surprised by any of this. Mike was never ready to take charge. The person who had it easy as a child never had to battle for anything. He exuded a certain haughtiness, as if he believed he could enter a room and learn stuff on the fly. In the classroom, that might work, but not in the real world. There is no forgiveness in business. Your GPA and last name are irrelevant to it. Mike had to learn the lesson the hard way. It wasn't only me who anticipated it. I began receiving calls and texts from folks I hadn't spoken to in months, former coworkers. "Man, you are missed here. It's a shambles without you," one guy said. I was informed by someone that the location resembles a sinking ship. I'm not sure how much longer I can stay. It was bittersweet, but flattering, all right. I had been working with these folks for years. Those who had backed and trusted me. I wanted to help when I heard them struggling. However, I knew better than to interfere. I had no intention of rushing to tidy up Mike's mess. I was no longer employed there. However, the way my parents handled it really got to me. They offered excuses for Mike rather than holding him responsible. There is a lot of strain on him. When someone inquired about the fraud accusations, my mother said, all he needs is some time to get his bearings. time. In less than 6 months, the man had almost brought the company to ruin. How much longer did he have to wait? Not to mention my sister. Through all of this, she was Mike's strongest supporter. Pretending to be a misunderstood genius of some sort. I'm not sure if she was truly crazy or simply too arrogant to acknowledge her error. In any case, there was enragement. She had advocated for Mike to be appointed CEO. I persuaded my folks that it was the proper decision. She was now intensifying her poor choice. For the most part, I avoided it, but one day I couldn't help myself. At the grocery store, I ran into an old family friend who remarked in passing how wonderful it must be to watch the next generation take over the company. Exciting isn't the word I'd use, I simply said with a smile. When they laughed, I wasn't kidding. It was almost therapeutic to watch the company fail. I felt as though all of my annoyance and rage at being passed over for Mike was being justified. I wasn't insane. I wasn't going overboard. They were now paying the consequences for their grave error. I didn't celebrate their failure, though. I had moved on, or I was attempting to. I had begun generating concepts for my own company, something I could start from scratch without outside help. My wife was really encouraging, pushing me to take the risk and take care of myself. It was both thrilling and frightening. I felt like I was in charge of my own destiny for the first time in years. My folks, meantime, were rushing. They were attempting to limit the harm and rebuild client trust, according to what I learned from mutual acquaintances. I wish you luck in that endeavor. It is almost tough to regain trust after it has been lost, particularly in the business sector and with the growing number of litigation. Their issues were more pressing. I didn't know how Mike was managing all of this. Since I quit, I hadn't spoken to him, and to be honest, I didn't give a damn. He was in over his head, though, based on what I heard. Some claimed that he was still making an effort to appear as though he had everything under control. Others asserted that he was about to have a breakdown. It wasn't my problem anyway. 6 months later, the business had shrunk to a ghost of its former self. Customers had left. My parents were in a dire situation as workers were quitting in large numbers. Although they hadn't contacted me yet, I figured that it will happen eventually. And I was prepared with my response when they did. The inevitable occurred 6 months after I left the family firm. Even though I had been preparing for it, I still had a range of conflicting feelings. My parents appeared older when I saw them standing at my door. They were more anxious than I had ever seen them. My dad had an awkward stiffness about him, as if he knew he had no choice but didn't want to be there. My mother's face, however, spoke for itself. Desperation. I didn't immediately invite them in. To be honest, I considered closing the door in their faces, but I refrained. Could we enter? With hesitation in his voice, my father asked. They shuffled in after I moved aside silently. There was instant tension in the room. My wife, who had been in the kitchen, looked at me but remained silent. She was also aware that this moment was approaching. She slipped upstairs in silence, leaving me to handle it. I waited for them to begin by sitting across from them with my arms crossed. First to jump in was my mother. She did it every time. Her voice faltered as she said, "We need your help." The companies, she hesitated, like saying it out loud would make it worse. It's in trouble. Mike made some mistakes, big ones. I didn't respond. I just stared at her, letting the silence stretch. It was clear she wanted me to fill the gap, to jump in and offer a solution. I didn't. Eventually, my dad spoke up. He's in over his head, he admitted, rubbing his temple like he had a headache. And now the company is facing lawsuits, losing clients. We quote, barely hanging on. This was a moment I'd thought about many times since I quit. I'd imagined them coming to me, asking me to fix things, and me laughing in their faces. But now that it was actually happening, I felt more annoyed than anything else. It wasn't satisfying or validating. It was just sad. "And what do you expect me to do about it?" I finally asked. My tone wasn't angry, but it wasn't kind either. I wanted them to squirm a little. They deserved it. My mom reached out, putting her hand on mine. "You know the business better than anyone," she said. "We need you to come back, please." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For years, all I wanted was for them to recognize my value. To admit I was the one keeping the company afloat. And now here they were, practically begging me to save them. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an insult. After everything, they still expected me to clean up their mess. "Why don't you ask Mike?" I said, pulling my hand away. "He's the CEO, right? Let him fix it. Mike can't handle it." My dad muttered, annoyance coming into his voice. "We made a mistake. We see that now. But this is larger than him. It's about the firm, about everything we've built, everything I've constructed," I corrected. "I'm the one who spent 12 years making that firm what it is, and you cast me away like I was nothing. My dad sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. He looked tired, dejected. "We thought we were doing the right thing," he said. "We believed Mike would offer something new to the table. But you were right. He wasn't prepared. We're now paying the price for it." It should have been satisfying to hear him acknowledge it, but it wasn't. It only made me more irate. They were aware that Mike wasn't prepared. They hadn't paid attention to what I had repeatedly informed them. I was asked to pick up the pieces now. With tears in her eyes, my mother said, "I'm sorry. We were mistaken. We ought to have trusted you. However, there is still time. This is still fixable." I got up and paced the room. "Do you want it fixed by me?" I said, raising my voice. "Do you really believe that I can just return and fix everything? Are you even able to hear? Before you didn't trust me, but now since you're in a dire situation, I'm suddenly acceptable." They remained silent, and my rage was only heightened by the quiet. "Is what you're asking even clear to you? You're requesting that I once more put my life on hold to save you from a predicament you caused. For what purpose? So you may inform me and give me a pat on the back. Well done, child. Prior to dismissing me once more, this isn't what it is." "Firmly," my father said. "The goal here is to save the business. Preserving our heritage. Your heritage?" I fired back. "Not no more." My mother began to cry and then sobbed uncontrollably into her hands. My dad sat there looking at the floor as if he was at a loss for what to do, and I felt horrible for a second. After all, they were my parents. But then I recalled the treachery, the humiliation, and the innumerable evenings I had worked late while they were out complimenting Mike on his high grades. More than their cries could ever soothe me. That infuriated me. "I am unable to assist you," finally I remarked in a firm voice. "I won't. Plans of my own have already begun to take shape. Now that I'm creating something for myself, I won't discard that to tidy up your mess." My father raised his head. His expression hardened. "That's it then? Are you simply going to abandon your family?" I let out a sour laugh. "You were the first to turn away from me. Don't try to make me feel bad about this. It won't function." Soon after, they departed. My dad looks like he wanted to argue but didn't have the energy, and my mom is still sniffling. I drew a trembling breath as the door shut behind them. When my wife came downstairs, she embraced me. "You made the correct decision," she said. "There is nothing that you owe them." She was correct. Of course I knew that, but it still ached. Walking away from the company had been hard enough. Walking away from my folks seemed even tougher, but I couldn't go back. Not now, not ever. That night, while I laid in bed, I pondered about what they'd said about salvaging the firm, about correcting problems. A part of me wanted to, not for them, but for myself, for the people who'd worked with me, the clients who'd trusted me. But another part of me realized it wasn't my responsibility anymore. They'd made their choice, and now they had to live with it. That night, feeling more confident than ever, I went to sleep. There was no turning back. The time has come to proceed. I experienced a peculiar sensation of clarity after my parents arrived at my house. I didn't look back for the first time in months. I had been thinking about what had happened for far too long, reliving the rage, disillusionment, and betrayal. But after literally and figuratively slamming that door on them, I knew it was time to concentrate on the future. I had to start my own business if I wasn't going to return to theirs. It's intimidating to start from scratch, even if you're an experienced professional. I didn't have a fancy team or a large office. Hell, at first, I didn't even have a decent plan. I only had the knowledge and abilities I had accumulated over the previous 12 years, and the will to show myself, and perhaps even them, that I was capable of doing this. Determining the type of business I wanted to start was the first step. All I knew was real estate. Therefore, that aspect was obvious. I wasn't merely looking to replicate my dad's business, though. I desired to do something better, something different. Over the years, I had gained a lot of knowledge about how to approach people as well as the business, customers, workers, everyone. My parents had always operated the company like a machine, closing agreements with little consideration for the individuals who worked on them. My goal was to create something more human and intimate. I began by contacting some of my previous customers. I had been working with these folks for years, those who had faith in me. I asked whether they would be interested in collaborating with me once more, and stated that I was launching my own business. The majority of them were excited, which surprised and relieved me. "We wanted to know when you will return to the game." "Mike has been a disaster," one of them stated. "We have been waiting for someone to take the initiative." I got the confidence boost I needed from their answers. Perhaps I could succeed after all if they had faith in me. However, gaining clients was only one aspect of the problem. I required a team as well. The business would not operate on its own. My former co-workers were helpful in this situation. After I left, I stayed in contact with some of them, and I knew that some of them weren't happy with the way things had been going under Mike's direction. I started making calls one by one. "Hey, I'm assembling something. Although it's small today, I believe it has potential," I informed them. "Do you want to?" The feedback was overwhelmingly favorable. A large number of them have already departed from my dad's business, fed up with the confusion and poor leadership. They were searching for a new employment in between jobs. One of them said right away, "I'm in." I have been anticipating this call. I established a small but capable crew in a few weeks. We only had a shared workspace and a lot of energy. We didn't have a nice office or fancy equipment. We were hungry and scrappy, just like in the early days of my dad's business. This time, though, it was my rules and my vision, creating a website, registering the business, and determining how to market ourselves were all part of the hectic process of starting a business. It was thrilling, but I hardly had time to breathe. Every little victory, a client joining, a lead becoming a sale, felt like a huge triumph. I was doing more than just working for the first time in years. I was making something, and it was amazing. Naturally, things weren't always easy. I had periods of uncertainty, wondering if I was taking on more than I could handle. At times, the strain of managing finances, logistics, and client relationships was too much to handle. However, each time I wanted to give up, I reminded myself of my motivation. I wasn't only establishing a company, I was demonstrating to myself that I was capable. Finding a balance between job and personal life was one of the most difficult tasks. Although I knew it wasn't easy for her, my wife was a huge support system. I put all of my energy into the business, frequently working late into the night while she worked full-time. "If you continue like this, you will burn out." One evening, while I was crouched over my laptop going over contracts, she gave me a warning. "I know," I responded, massaging my temples, "but it won't take off unless I push now." Although she didn't argue, I could see that she was worried. It served as a reminder that upholding the life we had created together was just as vital as growing the company. Though I wasn't quite certain how, I mentally noted that I needed to achieve a better balance. Things began to come together as the weeks passed. Client feedback was overwhelmingly good, and our first several sales finished without a hitch. "This reminds me of the past, when things were easier and more intimate," one of them told me. This hearing felt like confirmation, and I missed it. I was doing something correctly. In fact, the company started to expand. Growth wasn't particularly rapid, but it was consistent, and that was sufficient for me. I was unable to ignore the rumors regarding my dad's business in the meanwhile. It was rumored that the situation was becoming worse. Lawsuits were mounting, and they were losing customers one by one. It was difficult not to feel a little gratified. I had warned them after all. However, my main emotion was sympathy for the workers and customers who were caught in the crossfire. They were worthy of better. I was genuinely taken aback by the sheer number of those customers and staff who began approaching me. I didn't actively seek it out, at least not initially. However, when word spread that I was launching my own business, people contacted me. "Please let me know if you need additional employees." "I can no longer stand it here," remarked a former colleague. "We've always trusted you," said another client in an email. "Let's have a conversation." I wasn't poaching. They were approaching me, and it felt good, really. These were individuals who valued me and were interested in collaborating with me due to my contributions. It stood in sharp contrast to the way I had been treated by my family. We had outgrown our shared workspace by the end of the second month, so we began searching for a real office. Even though it was a minor accomplishment, it felt enormous. I couldn't help but smile as I stood there in that empty room, thinking of what might be. I owned this. Everything. I couldn't have it taken away. I wasn't only getting by, I was doing well, and I felt really free for the first time in a long time. Things with my family had gotten out of hand by the time I had gotten used to my new business routine. People were talking about what I was doing. Customers are moving to me. Workers are contacting me to join my team. The news quickly made its way to my sister and dad. Since they had been to my house, I had not talked to any of them, and I had no intention of doing so. They obviously weren't finished with me, though. Emails were the first thing. My father sent several different versions of the same message. He desired to speak in order to resolve the matter. I choose to disregard them. Then my mother began phoning, once a week at first, then every few days. I didn't answer. She eventually left a voicemail that infuriated me. She continued, her voice shaking with hardly disguised rage. "I hope you're happy. This family is being torn apart by you. How you manage to live with yourselves is beyond me." I didn't respond, so I erased the mail. What could be said? They had to lie in their bed after making it. No matter how much they tried to blame me, I wasn't the cause of their problem. However, when my sister became involved, things truly got out of hand. She went straight for the jugular, unlike my folks who were still trying to guilt me into returning. Suddenly, one day, I got a letter from a lawyer. I initially believed it to be an error. But I felt sick to my stomach as I read it. I was being accused of stealing customers and staff. The letter claimed that I had purposefully damaged their company by stealing important clients and employees. They demanded that I stop all surgeries right away if I didn't, claiming that I was breaking some kind of unwritten family covenant. They threatened to file a lawsuit. As I read it, I couldn't help but giggle. It was so absurd. How petty. When I worked for them, my contract did not have a non-compete clause. I made 2 checks. Even though they had absolutely no legal footing, the fact that they had used this strategy indicated me how desperate they were. I sent the letter to my lawyer rather than answering it myself. "Take care of it. I don't have time for this bullshit," I told him. He told me not to worry and that it was a false threat. Nevertheless, the entire experience left me with a negative taste. My folks unexpectedly came up at my workplace a few days later. They had never seen the new area before, and I could tell they weren't pleased. My dad's face was a mixture of disappointment and rage, while my mother's gaze was one of thinly veiled contempt. "Are you certain that this will work?" My father pointed to the office as he asked. "You're engaging in risky behavior." Unfazed, I reclined in my chair. "It's functioning already." "It isn't a game," I explained plainly. My mother's cheeks reddened with rage. "Everything is being ruined by you." She lost her temper. "Are you aware of the harm you are causing to this family? To us?" I got to my feet, speaking in a firm yet composed tone. "I'm building something for myself," I stated. "Something you didn't believe I could do. If you find that bothersome, that is your issue, not mine." After that, they left quickly. I believe they came to the conclusion that trying to guilt me was futile. But I was disturbed by their arrival. Not because of what they said, but rather because it validated a long-held suspicion of mine. The loss of the business wasn't the only thing that distressed them. They were angry that they could no longer control me. I had been the one they could rely on to keep things going smoothly for years. They were at a loss for what to do since I had given up so much of my life to support their goal. Neither the money nor the clients were the focus. It had to do with the dynamics of power. They also detested the fact that I had withdrawn it. In the meantime, things were getting worse at my dad's business. Their reputation was in ruins and employees were leaving in large numbers. I had heard that Mike was no longer showing up for work very often. I was informed that he had been seen appearing totally inebriated at a bar during the day. Even though I didn't feel sorry for him, I couldn't help but consider how my parents' decision might have prevented everything. According to what I understood, the company's legal team was having difficulty keeping up with the continuous lawsuits. I was not envious of them. Cleaning up Mike's mess was like attempting to use a garden hose to put out a forest fire. The inevitable collapse of the entire situation seemed imminent. I remained focused on my own business throughout it all. We were expanding our clientele and growing our staff in a steady manner. To assist us spread the word, I engaged a tiny marketing company, and it paid off almost instantly. The questions began to flood in, and for the first time in a long time, I had hope for the future. My wife entered the room with a glass of ginger one evening when I was going over our finances. "You know," she added as she took a seat beside me, "you seem happier than I've ever seen you." I put the papers down and grinned. I acknowledged that doing something for myself and without having to answer to anyone else feels fantastic. Her head rested against my shoulder. "You quote, re-worthy." I thought about what she said long after she had gone to bed. I had been pursuing someone else's approval for a very long time. My family, my parents, in a sense, even Mike. But at last I was taking care of myself, and I didn't give a damn about what other people thought for the first time. Sitting there surrounded by the results of my labor, I came to a significant realization. It wasn't simply about outshining Mike or proving my folks wrong. It was about demonstrating to myself that I could achieve more and that I didn't require their approval. And I realized then that I had made the proper decision. Permit them to mail their letters. Allow them to threaten you. There was no turning back. Never, ever. Months after my sister's ridiculous legal threats and my parents' surprise visit to my office, I was in a situation I hadn't anticipated. Satisfaction. My new company was doing nicely. Not flawlessly, of course, but sufficient to keep me occupied and hopeful. The idea of doing this together made it all feel even more significant. My wife had even begun discussing reducing her own work to work with me full-time. Nevertheless, the traces of my former existence persisted in the background. My folks weren't the type to simply accept things as they were. Even though I had blocked the most of their attempts to get in touch with me, Mike would occasionally reach out through mutual connections with bad news, or they would worry about the family business. It appeared like Mike had finally given in to the strain. Due to the case's financial drain and the loss of important clients, the company's revenue was almost non-existent. To keep the doors open, my dad had to sell off some assets, but it wasn't enough either. According to a handful of my former co-workers who recently joined me, the workplace was essentially abandoned. Those who remained were not loyal. They were doing so out of desperation. An old customer who had been with my dad's business longer than most called me one day. "The building was sold by your parents," he remarked. "I assumed you would be curious." Selling the office that had been the company's headquarters from day one took me by surprise. It was not merely a place of work. It represented everything we had created together. It was odd to hear that it was gone, not exactly depressed. However, it seemed as though another aspect of the past had vanished. "I appreciate you letting me know." I informed him that I no longer work with them. "I assumed so," he said. "I just thought someone who is still supporting you would want to hear it. Thank you for that." It served as a reminder that not everyone had abandoned me amid this chaos. I received another surprise a few weeks later. It wasn't a letter or a call this time. My dad sent me an email. Curiosity overcame me, and I nearly erased it without reading. An apology appeared in the subject line. I opened it and quickly read the first few lines, anticipating more justifications or requests for assistance. However, as I continued reading, I became aware that this time was different. He wasn't trying to place the responsibility on me or ask me to return. He was acknowledging that he had erred. He wrote, "I believed I was doing what was best for the family. However, I now realize that I allowed my pride to get in the way. I didn't want to acknowledge that I was mistaken about Mike, so I listened to your sister. I apologize for not realizing sooner that you were the one who deserved that job." For several paragraphs, the email described events from the past that I had long since forgotten. He discussed how much he had depended on me in the beginning, and how he was certain that the business could not have endured without my help. It seems unreal to read. Even though I had been waiting for these words for years, I wasn't sure how to react when they finally came. He made a comment near the end that really stuck with me. He wrote, "I know I can't fix what's happened. However, I'm hoping that one day you'll have the heart to pardon me." I did not respond to the email and closed it. The concept of forgiveness was complex. I had lost my anger. Not at all. However, I also wasn't prepared to allow them to return to my life. I had the impression that they were still attempting to drag me back in time, and I had put in too much effort to abandon that. In the meantime, my company was expanding. We added a couple additional staff members and relocated to a bigger office building. Eventually, a few of the customers who had remained faithful to my dad's business contacted me to inquire about working with me instead. After a few discussions, I overcame my initial reluctance and understood that they weren't merely seeking a bargain. Stability was what they sought. That's what I handed them. They also trusted me in exchange. Mike was staying with my sister once more when I last heard from him. Although the litigation had been resolved, the financial harm had already been done. However, it was said that he was searching for himself. It was anyone's guess what that signified in reality. I didn't feel sorry for him, but I also didn't wish him bad. He had wasted a chance that had been presented to him that he wasn't prepared for. I have nothing to do with that. As expected, my sister was struggling to deal with the aftermath. Based on what I've heard from people we share, she blamed everyone but herself for the outcome, which made her angry and resentful. The fact that my parents had ceased openly defending her told me all I needed to know. At last, they were recognizing her true self. Someone who was good at taking care of herself and no one else, rather than the intelligent daughter they had always admired. I felt liberated one day as I sat in my office and gazed out at the metropolitan skyline, genuinely free. The burden of expectations from my family, their manipulation, their disappointment. For so long it was all gone. I based my identity on their opinion of me and what I could do to win their acceptance. None of that mattered now, though. I wasn't starting my company in spite of them or to prove a point. I did it for my own benefit, for my spouse, for those who had faith in me, and it was sufficient. I doubt that I will ever be able to make amends with my family. Perhaps when the dust has finally settled, we'll figure out how to put the pieces back together. Or perhaps we won, T. In any case, I don't mind. I'm concentrating on the future for now, and it feels like mine for the first time in years.